I've never been an even slightly religious person, so the only time I ever hear something referred to as unholy is when my boyfriend is critiquing my morning farts. Thankfully though, my critique of the game Unholy, an immersive first-person horror adventure that seemingly came out of nowhere with surprising quality, will be significantly less scathing.
Your time is running out, my child.
These vines, they look like they will devour the whole city.
Unholy follows Dorothy, who at the game's opening is planning to escape from the Spring of Eternity, a Satanist-adjacent cult, after they decide to take her son, Gabriel, away from her. But the Spring of Eternity isn't some group of small-time backwoods crazies, and in the context of the game, even calling them a cult might be a stretch. Their main compound is surprisingly elegant, filled with towering marble pillars, dimly lit chandeliers, statues of their beloved leaders, and hell, even a reception desk. Outside, moms talk openly of their involvement with the Spring of Eternity while watching their kids run around on the playground, and flyers filled with cult propaganda openly hang in public spaces. Unholy's plot elevates the role of its antagonistic order to that of a well-established religion, and one that certainly doesn't take care of their own. Dorothy's only hope of retrieving Gabriel is to travel to the Eternal City, the afterlife to which he's been forcibly dragged by the cult's prophet, and bring him back. I don't want to spoil any more of the plot than what covers the first several minutes of the game or so, but I was surprised at the quality here. Levels are littered with notes from prior inhabitants giving context to the surrounding horrors, and do a fairly good job of coloring in the finer details of the story. One of my favorite entries was a semi-cheeky one complaining about being disappointed with how the afterlife turned out. It was kind of funny to me reading a character essentially say, wow, you know, this hell I signed up for isn't really all it's cracked up to be. But while that seems pretty obvious to us at first, the game spent some time delving into what happened within the ranks of the Order to turn the Eternal City into a true hell, when its denizens were clearly expecting more of a hell light or diet hell. Come on, all those extra calories. Now, frankly, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I fully understood what was happening in all parts of this plot, because the game's location and my reasons for being there started to feel a little murky at times, but it was entertaining throughout and elevated by generally solid voice work across the board and writing that was pretty decent despite a handful of obvious typos and subtitles that didn't always match their spoken counterparts. Voice work is not the only component of Unholy's sound design that deserves praise though. Everything here from the sound effects to the music are noticeably great. Early on, the game gives you a slingshot that can be used to solve puzzles or stun enemies with a variety of ammunition found throughout the environment that takes its namesake from a human emotion like sadness, desire, or anger. I'll go more into that in a bit, but for now I just want to call out how cool each of these ammunition types sounded when you aim them. The ammo called Anger is accompanied by a deep buzzing thrum and red glowing veins that burn with hatred, and the Sadness ammo swirls with gray mist and wails of mourning specters. Environmental sound design is no slouch either, with some levels being set to a background of screaming tortured souls that certainly, sets the mood. Visually, Unholy is pushing the definition of indie. The game looks genuinely great from both the perspectives of fidelity and art design. The environments feel reasonably varied and crammed with high-resolution details, lighting looks really great if you have the rig to be able to turn up the settings, and animations feel smooth and lacking the jank one would expect from such a relatively low-profile release. Settings allow for changes in shadow quality, resolution, anti-aliasing, DLSS, and some extra toggles for things like screen space reflections and volumetric fog. There aren't a ton of accessibility options, but the game allows tweaking of field of view, full rebinding of controls, and turning off all the annoying effects like chromatic aberration, motion blur, and film grain. If playing with a controller, I highly recommend immediately rebinding the sprint key to the left bumper unless you want to slaughter your thumb by forcing it to hold the left stick in the entire time you run. Let me give one major warning about Unholy's visuals to my small subset of ultra-wide monitor brethren. Sadly, at the moment, there is nothing resembling native ultra-wide support, with the game opting for a zoomed-in image over a properly scaled one. And unfortunately, even if you were to accept that and decide to play in windowed mode, there's currently a bug that locks windowed mode to 720p with no options whatsoever to change it. I'm hoping these things change over time with enough of a stink, but worth noting for now. Steam Deck performance is passable but not great. You'll usually get anywhere between 30 to 40 frames per second on a combo of medium and low settings, but this isn't a game that requires fast reflexes necessarily, so many will find it to be playable enough. Something about first-person games at 30 FPS just makes my head spin though, so I definitely did not opt for much time on the Steam Deck with this one. I've spent a lot of time blathering on about Unholy's presentation and story, so you probably want to know by this point how it plays. And while yes, like many horror games, the actual gameplay is where we start to see some weaknesses, for how much could have gone wrong, I think surprisingly little has. After the first hour with Unholy, I legitimately thought it was a horror-themed walking simulator with some simple puzzles littered throughout. The first few chapters of the game are like this. Lots of walking, lots of talking, and occasionally exploring for some items you need to progress. It's not boring, in my opinion, but it is all incredibly linear, and was threatening to be a game that didn't reach further than some walking around seeing horror tropes left and right. But before long, it begins to stick the landing. Its linearity is an asset to it, frankly, with few opportunities to get aimlessly turned around while searching for the next set piece. Some proper gameplay mechanics start being introduced, mainly in the form of the slingshot I mentioned earlier, that can help with both puzzle solving, some light combat, and even stealth sequences. The slingshot's ammo takes the form of pellets of sadness, desire, anger, or fear, each with a different use case. Anger can break through barriers, allowing you to access new areas or shatter locks on a chest. Sadness can create smoke that allows you to hide from enemies, and desire allows you to lure enemies away from you. I can't say the slingshot ever felt as effective as I wanted it to with some enemies, and aiming it felt a little janky, but overall it was fun to use and, as I mentioned before, presented in an appropriately creepy fashion. While unholy stealth sequences are bound to be divisive, they're generally kind of not bad. I don't think they're especially good either, don't mistake this as a glowing endorsement, but each piece kept me just engaged enough to keep me going. The enemies you have to hide from are reasonably smart, investigating anytime you dare enter their field of view, and sometimes not giving up until you hide in a locker, Alien Isolation style. They do sometimes behave a little erratically, even on occasion reacting to things that aren't you or seemingly seeing you through an obstacle, but overall these sections are decently implemented and, most importantly, properly balanced in difficulty. Not all sections have that luxury though, because a few sections definitely needed some more polish. One sequence early on had me collecting 3 different items, and because they were seemingly not collected in the exact order the developers intended, I wasn't able to progress until I reloaded the checkpoint. On the flip side, a different sequence required me to find a handle to open a door, but upon reaching the door let me just open it as is, making the handle I eventually found useless and having me carry it in my inventory literally for the rest of the game. That part was more funny to me than anything else, but yeah, the game could use a little bit more polish. There was also the occasional section that became frustrating if I didn't figure out exactly the way the developers intended for me to do things, and some trial and error can definitely result. Thankfully, such situations were more the exception than the norm. But Mike, I hear you say, this is a horror game. We can talk about slingshots and morning farts all you want, but is the game actually scary? Well, no, not really. But it's also clearly not trying that hard to be. There are sequences that get a bit tense for sure, but overall the game is more concerned about setting the mood than getting a reaction. Not once while playing did I feel like something jumped out to scare me, and yet I felt uneasy hiding from sentries while hearing the screams of the damned in the background. It's certainly atmospheric, and I like it that way, but I'm kind of a wimp with horror games, and I had no trouble whatsoever. Unholy is definitely not a perfect game. There are sections of frustrating design, hints of presentational jank, and some bugginess and technical issues holding it back a bit, but frankly, somehow it looks great, sounds great, and plays pretty well. It may not explicitly scare you, so don't go putting those adult pampers on quite yet, but despite some frustrations, it's a good time and one of the more polished, memorable examples of an indie horror experience in recent memory. If you're intrigued by a horror story that's light on the jump scares but heavy on immersion, I definitely recommend you give Unholy a look.